Picture this. It's the year 811, and you're a Byzantine diplomat walking into the court of Khan Krum of Bulgaria. The torches flicker against stone walls as you approach the throne, but something's wrong. The Khan raises his drinking cup for a toast, and your blood runs cold. That's not just any cup he's holding. That ornate, silver-lined vessel was once the skull of your emperor. Your emperor, Nikephoros I, ruler of the mighty Byzantine Empire, now reduced to a macabre trophy that holds wine at enemy feasts. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy or medieval legend. This actually happened, and the story of how the most powerful man in the known world ended up as a drinking cup reveals everything about the brutal realities of 9th century warfare, the shocking collapse of imperial power, and why sometimes being emperor meant you were just one bad decision away from becoming someone else's dinnerware. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a simple military campaign turned into one of history's most humiliating defeats, why an emperor's skull became the ultimate psychological weapon, and what this gruesome tale tells us about the savage world of medieval politics. But first, let me show you just how catastrophically wrong things can go when empires collide. The year 802 marked a turning point that would echo through Byzantine corridors for generations. While most people were worried about their daily bread and avoiding the plague, a man named Nikephoros was orchestrating one of the most audacious power grabs in imperial history. This wasn't your typical noble with a fancy bloodline and inherited claims. Nikephoros was a bureaucrat, a finance minister who spent his days buried in tax records and treasury accounts. Imagine your accountant suddenly deciding to overthrow the government, except this accountant actually pulled it off. Empress Irene had been ruling Byzantium with an iron fist, but her reign was about to hit a major snag. Picture the scene. Frankish ambassadors sitting in Constantinople's Grand Palace, negotiating a marriage between Irene and Charlemagne that would unite the Eastern and Western empires. Sounds romantic until you realize this political marriage would essentially hand over Byzantine independence to the Franks. Some Byzantine officials looked at this arrangement and thought, absolutely not. We're not becoming a province of Charlemagne's empire just because our empress wants a husband. Enter Nikephoros, the ultimate inside man. While those Frankish diplomats were still counting their chickens before they hatched, a conspiracy was brewing right under their noses. The coup was swift, decisive, and absolutely brutal in its efficiency. One day, Irene was negotiating to become queen of a unified empire. The next day, she was deposed, exiled, and watching her former finance minister sit on the throne she'd thought was hers forever. But here's where things get interesting. Nikephoros wasn't content with just seizing power. He looked at the empire's books and nearly had a heart attack. Decades of warfare, bureaucratic incompetence, and imperial extravagance had left Byzantium essentially broke. The treasury was emptier than a tavern after last call. Enemy armies were pressing from every direction while the imperial coffers couldn't even fund basic military supplies. What do you do when you inherit a bankrupt empire surrounded by enemies? If you're Nikephoros, you become the most hated man in Byzantium by implementing the kind of financial reforms that would make a modern austerity government look generous. New taxes appeared faster than weeds after rain. Every village suddenly owed the state a fully equipped soldier. Wealthy nobles who'd enjoyed centuries of tax privileges found themselves paying like everyone else. Merchants discovered new regulations strangling their businesses at every turn. The peasants hated him for the crushing tax burden. The nobles despised him for eliminating their special privileges. The merchants cursed his name for the endless bureaucratic red tape. Even the church leaders grumbled about his interference in religious affairs. Nikephoros had managed to unite the entire empire in one thing, wanting him gone. Yet somehow, his harsh measures worked. The treasury started filling up again. The army got its equipment and supplies. The empire's finances stabilized for the first time in decades. Meanwhile, something far more dangerous was brewing in the north. While Nikephoros was busy making enemies at home with his financial wizardry, a man named Krum was consolidating power in Bulgaria and turning himself into the kind of military genius that keeps emperors awake at night. This wasn't just another barbarian chief leading raids for cattle and slaves. Krum was building something unprecedented. A centralized Bulgarian state with written laws, organized armies, and territorial ambitions that directly threatened Byzantine supremacy. The transformation was staggering. In less than a decade, Krum had destroyed the Avar Khaganate, doubled Bulgaria's territory, and seized control of some of the richest lands in southeastern Europe. The fertile Pannonian Plain, the gold mines of Transylvania, the strategic mountain passes that controlled trade routes between east and west. Bulgaria wasn't just expanding, it was becoming a legitimate rival to Byzantine power. What made Krum particularly dangerous was his combination of traditional steppe warfare tactics with sophisticated political organization. He could field armies that moved like lightning across vast distances, striking where enemies least expected, then vanishing before retaliation could arrive. But unlike typical nomadic raiders, Krum was building permanent institutions. His law code was remarkably progressive for its time, providing social services for the poor while maintaining iron discipline through severe punishments for crime. The irony was delicious. While Nikephoros was implementing harsh policies that made him despised by his own people, Krum was creating a state that actually took care of its citizens while maintaining order through fear. Bulgarian peasants had legal protections and social safety nets. Byzantine peasants got higher taxes and military conscription. Guess which system was winning more hearts and minds along the disputed frontier? By 809, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Bulgarian raids were penetrating deeper into Byzantine territory with each passing season. Frontier towns that had stood for centuries were falling to Krum's expanding armies. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to the Euphrates was being systematically carved up by a people they'd always considered barbarians. Nikephoros faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could continue his defensive strategy, strengthening fortifications, and hoping the Bulgarian expansion would eventually stall. Or he could take the fight directly to Krum's heartland and settle the matter once and for all. For a man who'd built his reputation on bold financial reforms and decisive action, there was really only one option. The emperor began assembling what would become one of the largest armies in Byzantine history. Troops were called up from every corner of the empire. Elite units that had never served together found themselves marching under the same banners. The logistical effort was staggering, feeding, equipping, and moving 70,000 men across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. This wasn't just about military strategy. Nikephoros was making a statement to his critics at home and his enemies abroad. The man who'd been dismissed as a mere accountant was about to prove he could lead armies as effectively as he managed budgets. The emperor who'd been accused of caring more about taxes than territories was going to demonstrate that Byzantine military might could still crush any challenger. The confidence was intoxicating. After all, what could a barbarian Khan with his ragtag collection of tribal warriors possibly do against the disciplined legions of the greatest empire on earth? Byzantium had survived the Arabs, the Bulgars before, countless other enemies who'd thought they could challenge imperial supremacy. This Krum character might have had some recent successes, but he'd never faced the full might of an imperial army led by an emperor determined to secure his legacy. Intelligence reports suggested that Krum was actually trying to avoid a direct confrontation. The Bulgarian Khan had sent peace offerings, apparently recognizing that his forces couldn't stand against such overwhelming numbers. Nikephoros rejected these overtures with contempt. Why negotiate with someone you're about to crush completely? The stage was set for what everyone expected would be a glorious imperial victory. 70,000 of Byzantium's finest soldiers, led by an emperor determined to prove his military credentials, marching against a barbarian Khan who seemed to be desperately seeking peace rather than war. The Byzantine court was already planning the victory celebrations. Poets were composing verses about the emperor's triumph. Artists were sketching designs for commemorative monuments. Nobody could have predicted that within weeks, that same emperor would be dead in a mountain pass, his army annihilated, and his skull being carefully prepared to become the most infamous drinking cup in medieval history. What happened next would haunt Byzantine nightmares for centuries. In May 811, Nikephoros gathered his massive army near Adrianople and began the march that would either cement his reputation as a military genius or destroy everything he'd worked to build. The emperor was riding high on confidence, surrounded by his finest generals and leading what many considered the most formidable force Byzantium had assembled in decades. The initial phase went exactly according to plan. The Byzantine war machine rolled through the Bulgarian countryside like an unstoppable tide. Villages surrendered without resistance. Local populations fled rather than face the approaching juggernaut. Military engineers cleared mountain passes with mechanical precision, while supply trains kept the army fed and equipped. This was imperial power at its most impressive, a demonstration of organizational capability that few nations could match. Krum's response seemed to confirm every assumption about barbarian weakness. The Bulgarian Khan kept retreating, abandoning defensive positions that could have cost the Byzantines dearly. His forces melted away before the advancing army like morning mist before sunrise. Intelligence reports suggested panic in the Bulgarian ranks, with tribal leaders abandoning Krum's cause and fleeing beyond the Danube. The emperor's confidence swelled with each passing day. His generals competed to offer the most optimistic assessments of enemy weakness. Court chroniclers traveling with the army filled their scrolls with glowing accounts of imperial triumph. This was going to be easier than anyone had dared hope. Krum was proving to be just another barbarian chief whose reputation exceeded his actual capabilities. On the 20th of July, the Byzantine army reached the outskirts of Pliska, Krum's capital. The city's defenses looked impressive from a distance, but Nikephoros wasn't impressed. He'd seen stronger fortifications crumble before imperial siege engines. The emperor divided his forces into 3 columns, each approaching from a different direction to prevent any possibility of escape. This was textbook military strategy, the kind of coordinated assault that had brought down countless enemy strongholds. What the Byzantines discovered inside Pliska exceeded their wildest dreams of conquest. The Bulgarian capital wasn't just wealthy. It was absolutely stuffed with treasure. Gold and silver filled storage rooms to overflowing. Precious stones glittered in countless jewelry boxes. Silk fabrics from distant lands lined entire warehouses. The accumulated wealth of Krum's expanding empire lay spread before them like a banquet prepared by the gods themselves. But something darker took hold of the imperial forces once they entered the city. The disciplined advance became a frenzied sack. Soldiers who'd maintained perfect formation during the march suddenly transformed into pillaging mobs. The systematic conquest devolved into something far more savage and uncontrolled. What followed wasn't warfare. It was systematic brutality that would make medieval chroniclers struggle for words to describe the horror. Byzantine troops didn't just loot the city, they unleashed a campaign of terror that targeted the most defenseless residents. Children were dragged from their homes and crushed under millstones in scenes that shocked even hardened warriors. Families were slaughtered in their houses while soldiers competed to see who could devise the most creative forms of murder. The agricultural devastation was equally methodical. Fields ready for harvest were burned to ash. Livestock were slaughtered not for food but for the sheer pleasure of destruction. Oxen had their tendons cut so they couldn't work the fields even if they survived. This wasn't military strategy. It was an attempt to erase Bulgarian civilization from the landscape entirely. Nikephoros watched this carnage unfold and made a decision that would seal his fate. Instead of restraining his troops or maintaining military discipline, he encouraged the destruction while carefully controlling the distribution of portable wealth. The emperor locked away Krum's personal treasury for himself, but allowed his soldiers free rein to terrorize the population. He wanted to send a message that would echo across the Balkans. This is what happens when you challenge Byzantine supremacy. The psychological calculation seemed sound. Break the enemy's will through overwhelming brutality, and future resistance becomes unthinkable. Make the cost of defying imperial authority so horrific that even the thought of rebellion dies in people's hearts. Transform military victory into permanent subjugation through strategic terror. But while Nikephoros was busy orchestrating this campaign of intimidation, Krum was turning the emperor's greatest strength into his most dangerous weakness. Every day the Byzantines spent pillaging Pliska was another day for the Bulgarian Khan to mobilize forces, coordinate with allies, and prepare the kind of counterattack that would catch an overconfident enemy completely off guard. The Bulgarian response was unlike anything the Byzantines had encountered before. Krum didn't just rally his regular troops, He armed every person capable of holding a weapon. Women received swords and spears alongside their brothers and husbands. Peasants found themselves equipped with military gear and assigned to combat units. Even children old enough to carry supplies became part of the mobilization effort. This wasn't desperate improvisation, it was calculated strategy. Krum understood that his only chance against such overwhelming numbers was to transform the entire population into a fighting force. Every Bulgarian became a potential soldier, every village a recruitment center, every mountain path a potential battleground where local knowledge could overcome professional training. The Khan's diplomatic skills proved just as important as his military planning. Hungarian forces joined the Bulgarian coalition, bringing additional warriors and crucial intelligence about Byzantine movements. Avar mercenaries who'd served with distinction in previous campaigns rallied to Krum's banner. What had started as a Bulgarian defense was becoming a multinational effort to humble imperial arrogance. Meanwhile, the Byzantine army was growing soft from weeks of unopposed pillaging. Discipline eroded as soldiers became more interested in dividing loot than maintaining military readiness. The tight formations that had characterized their advance gave way to scattered groups more concerned with individual profit than collective security. Victory had made them careless, and carelessness in medieval warfare was usually fatal. Nikephoros finally decided it was time to return to Constantinople with his spoils and captives. The campaign had exceeded expectations, delivering both military victory and enormous wealth. The emperor could already envision his triumphant return to the capital, where critics who'd questioned his military capabilities would be forced to acknowledge his genius. This would be the achievement that secured his dynasty for generations. The route selection proved crucial to everything that followed. Nikephoros had originally planned a longer march through Moesia that would have taken his army through more defensible terrain, but reports of Bulgarian mobilization convinced him to choose the shortest path home through the mountain passes. Speed seemed more important than security when facing what appeared to be a desperate enemy's last-ditch effort. The emperor's scouts brought increasingly disturbing news as the army approached the mountains. The passes weren't clear as expected. Wooden barriers blocked the most direct routes. Bulgarian forces were visible on the heights overlooking the valleys. What had looked like a simple withdrawal was starting to resemble something far more dangerous. By the 25th of July, the Byzantine army found itself approaching the Vărbitsa pass with growing unease. The narrow valley stretched ahead like a tunnel with steep walls on both sides, the perfect terrain for an ambush, if anyone had been foolish enough to walk into such an obvious trap. But retreat seemed impossible with 70,000 men strung out across miles of mountain roads. Nikephoros rode at the head of his army, surrounded by generals whose confidence was evaporating with each passing hour. The emperor, who'd been so certain of victory just days before, was now muttering to his companions about feeling like a bird trapped in a cage. The man who'd rejected Krum's peace offers was beginning to understand that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone far cleverer than he'd imagined. The trap was about to snap shut, and the most powerful man in the known world was about to discover that sometimes the difference between triumph and catastrophe comes down to a single miscalculation in a mountain pass where the dead don't get proper burials and the living become drinking cups. The morning of the 26th of July dawned with the kind of eerie stillness that makes experienced soldiers check their weapons twice. Nikephoros had spent a sleepless night in his tent, listening to the sounds of an army that was slowly beginning to understand it might not make it home. The emperor's advisors whispered among themselves, but nobody wanted to be the one to tell their leader that his brilliant campaign had turned into a potential disaster. The Byzantine cavalry had returned from their scouting missions with news that made everyone's blood run cold. The pass ahead wasn't just blocked, it was fortified. Massive wooden walls stretched across the narrowest points, creating choke points that would funnel any attacking force into killing zones. Worse still, Bulgarian forces were positioned on every ridge and hilltop overlooking the valley. They weren't just trapped, they were surrounded. Krum had spent those weeks while the Byzantines were busy pillaging his capital, doing something far more important than mourning his losses. The Khan had been studying the terrain, positioning his forces, and creating what military historians would later recognize as one of the most perfectly executed ambushes in medieval warfare. Every tree, every rock, Every shadow had been turned into part of an elaborate killing machine designed specifically for this moment. The emperor's generals gathered around him as the morning light revealed the full extent of their predicament. These weren't inexperienced commanders. They'd led armies across 3 continents and faced enemies from the Arabian Peninsula to the Danube. But looking at the wooden barriers ahead and the Bulgarian positions above, even the most optimistic among them struggled to find encouraging words. "Even if we had wings, we could not escape from peril," Nikephoros reportedly muttered, and those words would haunt Byzantine chronicles for centuries. The man who'd been so confident just days before was now facing the reality that his strategic genius had led them into a trap that might claim them all. The emperor who'd rejected peace offers was discovering that sometimes pride comes with a price that can't be paid with gold or silver. The wooden barriers weren't just obstacles, they were psychological warfare made manifest. Krum knew that heavily armored Byzantine troops would struggle to assault uphill positions while under constant arrow fire from above. The barriers would force them to bunch together, making perfect targets for Bulgarian archers who knew every angle and distance in this valley. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Some generals urged an immediate assault on the fortifications. Better to die fighting than to sit in the valley waiting for the inevitable. Others suggested attempting to negotiate, perhaps offering ransom for safe passage. A few even whispered about trying to find alternative routes, though everyone knew that 70,000 men couldn't simply disappear into the mountains without supplies or local knowledge. Nikephoros made the worst possible decision. He chose to do nothing. The emperor set up camp in the valley floor and waited, as if hoping the situation would somehow resolve itself. This paralysis gave Krum exactly what he needed: time to coordinate the final phase of his plan and ensure that every Bulgarian fighter knew their role in what was about to unfold. The Bulgarian forces weren't just random tribal warriors thrown together in desperation. Krum had organized them with the precision of a chess master moving pieces into position. Archers were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the valley floor into a death trap. Spearmen waited behind the wooden barriers, ready to repel any assault that somehow managed to reach the fortifications. Cavalry units were concealed in side valleys, prepared to cut off any retreat attempts. But the real genius of Krum's plan wasn't the positioning of his forces, it was the timing. The Bulgarian Khan had studied Byzantine military doctrine and knew their strengths and weaknesses better than most imperial generals. He understood that heavily armored troops fighting uphill in narrow terrain would lose their primary advantages of discipline and coordination. In the confined space of the pass, individual courage mattered less than local knowledge and terrain advantage. As night fell on the 25th of July, both armies prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive moment. Byzantine soldiers checked their weapons and armor, wrote final letters to families they might never see again, and tried to find comfort in prayers that seemed to echo strangely off the valley walls. Many had fought in campaigns across the known world, but this felt different. This felt final. The Bulgarian forces were equally tense, but their tension came from anticipation rather than dread. They'd watched their capital burn and their people slaughtered. They'd seen Byzantine soldiers crush children under millstones and destroy fields that had fed families for generations. This wasn't just about military victory, it was about justice, revenge, and proving that even the mighty Byzantine Empire could be brought to account for its actions. Krum himself moved through his positions that night, speaking quietly with his commanders and ensuring every detail was perfect. The Khan who'd once offered peace to avoid this confrontation was now committed to making it as devastating as possible. He'd seen what Byzantine mercy looked like in the ruins of Pliska, and he intended to respond in kind. The attack began before dawn with a sound that would haunt survivor accounts for decades afterward. Not the clash of weapons or the shouts of charging warriors, but the whisper of thousands of arrows launched simultaneously in the darkness. Bulgarian archers had spent weeks calculating trajectories and distances, turning the valley floor into a killing zone where nowhere was safe, and every shadow might hide death. Byzantine soldiers woke to find their camp under attack from every direction at once. Arrows fell like deadly rain, finding gaps in armor and striking down men who'd survived dozens of previous battles. The darkness made organized response impossible. Nobody could tell where the attacks were coming from or how many enemies they faced. It was chaos engineered with mathematical precision. The wooden barriers that had seemed like obstacles now revealed their true purpose. They weren't meant to stop the Byzantine army. They were meant to channel it into specific areas where Bulgarian weapons could inflict maximum damage. Every gap, every opening had been calculated to create choke points where imperial numbers would become a disadvantage rather than a strength. Nikephoros tried to rally his troops, but the emperor, who'd been so decisive in financial matters, found himself paralyzed by military catastrophe. Commands were shouted and contradicted before they could be implemented. Units moved in different directions based on conflicting orders. The disciplined war machine that had conquered Pliska was disintegrating into a mob of terrified individuals fighting for their lives. The Bulgarian assault wasn't just militarily effective, it was psychologically devastating. These weren't the retreating barbarians the Byzantines had been chasing for weeks. These were organized, coordinated forces, fighting with the fury of people defending their homeland and avenging their dead. Every arrow that found its mark, every spear thrust that brought down an imperial soldier, was payback for the horrors inflicted on Pliska. As dawn broke over the valley, the full extent of the disaster became clear. The mighty Byzantine army that had seemed invincible just hours before was trapped, surrounded, and being systematically destroyed by forces they'd dismissed as inferior. The emperor, who'd come to crush a barbarian uprising, was discovering that sometimes barbarians fight back with devastating effectiveness. The muddy river that ran through the pass began to change color as wounded and dying men fell into its waters. Some drowned, trying to escape the arrow storm. Others were trampled by their own comrades in the panic to find safety that didn't exist. The valley that had seemed like a convenient route home was becoming a mass grave for the flower of Byzantine military might. Nikephoros himself was struck down in the chaos, though accounts differ on exactly how the emperor met his end. Some sources suggest he was killed by arrows. Others claim he fell to Bulgarian spears during a final desperate charge. What everyone agrees on is that when the fighting finally ended, the man who'd rejected Krum's peace offers lay dead among thousands of his soldiers. His purple boots, the only thing that distinguished his corpse from the common troops who'd followed him to disaster. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented in Byzantine military history. Not since the disaster at Adrianople centuries earlier had an imperial army been so completely annihilated. Entire units were wiped out to the last man. Generals who'd commanded respect across the known world died alongside the rawest recruits. The carefully maintained military hierarchy that had sustained Byzantine power for centuries collapsed in a single morning of perfectly executed slaughter. But for Krum, the military victory was only the beginning. The Bulgarian Khan had studied the customs of his steppe ancestors, and he knew that true triumph required more than just defeating your enemies on the battlefield. It required claiming their power, their essence, their very souls. And there was one ancient tradition that would serve this purpose perfectly. The emperor's body was dragged to Krum's tent, identified by those distinctive purple boots that marked imperial rank. The Khan who'd once sought peace was now face to face with the man who'd rejected his overtures and ordered the slaughter of Bulgarian civilians. This moment would define not just Krum's reign, but the relationship between Byzantium and Bulgaria for generations to come. What happened next would become one of the most infamous scenes in medieval history, a moment when ancient traditions met imperial pride and created something that would haunt diplomatic relations for decades. The Skull Cup was about to be born, and with it, a new chapter in the savage politics of 9th century Europe. The creation of the Skull Cup wasn't a moment of blind rage or battlefield savagery. This was calculated ritual, performed with the kind of deliberate precision that transforms a military victory into a psychological weapon that would terrorize enemies for decades. Krum didn't just want to defeat the Byzantine Empire. He wanted to claim its power, absorb its strength, and send a message that would echo through every palace and fortress from Constantinople to Rome. The process began immediately after Nikephoros was identified among the corpses. Bulgarian warriors carefully separated the emperor's head from his body. But this wasn't crude battlefield butchery. The Khan's craftsmen had been preparing for this moment, studying the ancient traditions of their ancestors who'd learned that drinking from an enemy's skull wasn't just about humiliation, it was about spiritual conquest. The preparation took several days. during which Krum displayed the emperor's head on a pike for all to see. Byzantine survivors who'd been taken prisoner were forced to witness this spectacle, watching their former leader reduced to a trophy that marked the complete reversal of imperial fortune. The man who'd ordered children crushed under millstones was now nothing more than a gruesome decoration swaying in the Bulgarian mountain breeze. But the real artistry came in the transformation that followed. Skilled craftsmen worked meticulously to hollow out the skull, removing every trace of brain matter and organic material that might decay or create unpleasant odors. The bone was cleaned with techniques passed down through generations of steppe warriors who understood that a proper skull cup required perfect preparation to serve its ceremonial purpose. The silver lining wasn't just decorative, it was symbolic. The precious metal transformed the emperor's remains from mere bone into something approaching sacred artifact. Bulgarian smiths hammered thin sheets of silver into the skull's interior, creating a seamless surface that would hold wine without contamination, while adding an element of luxury that made the vessel worthy of a Khan's table. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The rim was carefully smoothed and polished until it felt comfortable against the lips. The silver was etched with decorative patterns that caught firelight during evening feasts. Every detail was calculated to create not just a functional drinking vessel, but a masterpiece of psychological warfare that would unnerve enemies and inspire allies with equal effectiveness. When the skull cup was finally complete, Krum didn't simply toss it aside or display it as a static trophy. The Khan understood that the true power of this artifact lay in its active use. Every time he raised the cup to his lips, every toast made with imperial bone, every diplomatic meeting where wine was poured into Nikephoros' remains, these moments multiplied the psychological impact beyond what any single battlefield victory could achieve. The first ceremonial use of the skull cup became legendary throughout the Bulgarian court. Krum filled it with wine and raised it high before his assembled chieftains, speaking words that would be remembered long after the last witnesses had died. The toast wasn't just to victory, it was to the complete transformation of the regional balance of power. The empire that had seemed invincible was now providing dinnerware for its former enemies. The spiritual dimension of this ritual went far deeper than simple trophy-taking. Ancient steppe traditions held that consuming from an enemy's skull allowed the victor to absorb their opponent's courage, wisdom, and life force. By drinking from Nikephoros' remains, Krum wasn't just humiliating a dead foe, he was claiming the emperor's power for himself and his people. This belief system explained why the skull cup became such a central element of Bulgarian court ceremony. Important decisions were made while Krum held the vessel. Treaties were negotiated with the emperor's remains sitting prominently on the Khan's table. Military strategies were discussed while wine flowed from what had once housed imperial thoughts and ambitions. The psychological warfare aspect was equally calculated. When Byzantine diplomats eventually arrived to negotiate prisoner exchanges or territorial agreements, they found themselves forced to conduct business while their former emperor's skull held wine at the enemy's table. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who reject Bulgarian peace offers and choose war instead. These diplomatic encounters became exercises in carefully controlled humiliation. Krum would often insist that visiting Byzantine officials share drinks with him, pouring wine from the skull cup into their goblets. The diplomats faced an impossible choice: refuse and risk insulting their host during delicate negotiations, or accept and participate in the desecration of their former leader's remains. The practical impact on Byzantine foreign policy was immediate and devastating. Future emperors would think twice before launching campaigns against Bulgaria, knowing that failure might result in their own skulls joining Nikephoros' in Krum's collection. The deterrent effect was worth more than a dozen military victories, creating a zone of fear around Bulgarian territory that protected the kingdom far more effectively than any fortress wall. But the skull cup's influence extended beyond simple intimidation. It became a symbol of possibility for other enemies of Byzantium, proof that even the mightiest empire could be brought low by determined opponents. Arab caliphs, Frankish kings, and Italian princes all heard the story and understood that imperial power had limits that could be exceeded by clever strategy and ruthless execution. The ritualistic use of the cup also served important internal purposes within Bulgarian society. Every time Krum drank from imperial bone, he reinforced his own legitimacy as a ruler strong enough to defeat emperors. The skull cup became physical proof of his divine favor, evidence that the gods smiled upon his reign and supported his expansion of Bulgarian power. Court ceremonies evolved around the artifact, with specific protocols governing when and how it could be used. The skull cup appeared at coronations, treaty signings, military planning sessions, and religious festivals. It became so central to Bulgarian royal symbolism that later Khans would struggle to match the psychological impact of Krum's original trophy. The preservation of the cup required constant attention from court specialists who understood the delicate balance between maintaining its symbolic power and preventing physical decay. The silver lining needed regular polishing to maintain its gleam. The bone required careful treatment to prevent cracking or discoloration that might diminish its impact during important ceremonies. Stories about the skull cup spread throughout medieval Europe faster than news of actual military campaigns. Chroniclers in distant kingdoms wrote detailed accounts based on second-hand reports from terrified Byzantine diplomats. The tale grew in the telling, with each retelling adding new details about the cup's creation and use that enhanced its legendary status. The cup's reputation eventually transcended its original political purpose, becoming a symbol of divine justice among peoples who'd suffered under imperial oppression. Christian communities that had been persecuted by Byzantine authorities saw Krum's trophy as proof that God punished prideful rulers who forgot their mortality. Islamic scholars cited it as evidence that earthly power meant nothing without divine favor. Even within Byzantium itself, the skull cup became a powerful reminder of imperial vulnerability. Court officials whispered about it during policy debates, using it as shorthand for the dangers of military overconfidence. Remember, Nikephoros' cup became a cautionary phrase that could silence the most aggressive warhawks in imperial councils. The artifact's psychological impact was so profound that it influenced Byzantine military doctrine for generations. Future campaigns were planned with obsessive attention to retreat routes and escape strategies. Generals who might have pursued aggressive tactics instead chose conservative approaches that prioritized survival over glory. The skull cup had fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of an entire civilization, but perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the skull cup was how it transformed Krum from a regional barbarian leader into a figure of international significance. The man who'd once offered peace to avoid confrontation was now recognized as one of the most dangerous opponents Byzantium had ever faced. His name was spoken with the same reverence reserved for legendary conquerors like Attila or Alaric. The cup also established precedents that would echo through centuries of Balkan warfare. Future conflicts between Bulgarians and Byzantines carried an extra edge of savagery, with both sides understanding that defeat might result in the kind of posthumous humiliation that Nikephoros had suffered. The rules of civilized warfare, already tenuous in medieval Europe, became even more fragile in this region where skull cups represented the ultimate victory. As news of the emperor's fate reached Constantinople, the immediate crisis wasn't just military or political, it was existential. How do you maintain the divine mystique of imperial power when your emperor's skull is being used as a wine goblet by barbarian enemies? The very foundations of Byzantine legitimacy were shaking under the weight of this unprecedented humiliation. The succession crisis that followed Nikephoros' death was complicated by the skull cup's symbolic power. His son, Staurakios, paralyzed from wounds received in the same battle, struggled to project strength while knowing that his father's remains were providing entertainment at enemy feasts. The new emperor's authority was undermined before he could even establish control over his own court. Byzantine propaganda machines worked overtime to minimize the skull cup's significance, but their efforts were hampered by the artifact's undeniable reality. How do you spin away the fact that your emperor's head has become dinnerware? Court historians found themselves writing increasingly desperate accounts that tried to frame the disaster as a temporary setback rather than a fundamental shift in regional power dynamics. The cup's existence also created practical diplomatic problems that would plague Byzantine foreign relations for years. How do you negotiate with someone who literally drinks from your predecessor's skull? Traditional diplomatic protocols had no provisions for dealing with this level of calculated insult. Every meeting with Bulgarian representatives became an exercise in swallowing pride, while trying to maintain some semblance of imperial dignity. Religious authorities faced their own theological challenges in explaining how God had allowed such a fate to befall a Christian emperor. Some claimed it was divine punishment for Nikephoros' harsh policies toward the church. Others argued it was a test of faith that would ultimately strengthen the empire. None could explain why Providence had permitted such spectacular humiliation of Christ's representative on earth. The Skull Cup had become more than just a trophy. It was a catalyst that accelerated the decline of Byzantine prestige throughout the medieval world. Every enemy of the empire now knew that imperial power could be not just defeated, but utterly degraded. The psychological barrier that had protected Byzantium for centuries, the belief that challenging the empire was tantamount to challenging God himself, had been shattered, along with Nikephoros' army, in that Bulgarian mountain pass. The ripple effects of that silver-lined skull reached far beyond the immediate borders of the Bulgarian Khanate and the Byzantine Empire. Medieval Europe was a world where reputation mattered more than actual military strength, and Krum's macabre trophy had just rewritten the rules of international relations in the most dramatic way possible. Word traveled faster than armies in those days, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and refugees who spread tales that grew more terrifying with each retelling. Picture the scene in royal courts across Europe as the news arrived. Frankish nobles who'd been planning their own campaigns against Byzantine territories suddenly found themselves reconsidering their strategies. If the mighty empire that had stood for 8 centuries could see its emperor reduced to a drinking cup, what did that mean for everyone else's mortality? The Skull Cup wasn't just humiliating Byzantium, it was forcing every medieval ruler to confront the possibility that their own heads might end up decorating enemy tables. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad received the news with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. Byzantine defeats were always welcome in the Islamic world, but the sheer brutality of Krum's trophy raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare itself. Arab commanders who'd spent decades fighting the Byzantines with conventional tactics now wondered if they'd been playing by rules that their enemies might abandon at any moment. Venice, that rising maritime power that would eventually challenge Byzantium for control of Mediterranean trade, saw opportunity in the empire's humiliation. Venetian merchants began negotiating more aggressively with Byzantine officials, who could no longer project the same aura of invincible imperial authority. When your emperor's skull is holding wine at enemy feasts, your trade representatives lose significant leverage in commercial negotiations. The psychological transformation was most visible in the imperial capital itself. Constantinople, that jewel of the medieval world, began showing signs of the deep trauma that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about reality shattered overnight. The city that had considered itself the center of Christian civilization was now forced to acknowledge that its emperor was providing dinnerware for pagans who drank toasts to his destruction. Court ceremonies took on an almost desperate quality as surviving Byzantine officials tried to maintain the illusion of imperial majesty while knowing that their former leader's remains were being used for entertainment purposes. Hundreds of miles away, every state function became an exercise in collective denial, with participants pretending that nothing had fundamentally changed, while privately wondering if they might be next to end up as decorative cups. The military implications were even more severe than the diplomatic ones. Byzantine recruitment efforts suffered as potential soldiers heard stories about what happened to the last imperial army that marched against Bulgaria. Why volunteer to serve in forces that might end up providing skull cups for barbarian feasts? The empire's legendary military machine began showing signs of the demoralization that would plague it for decades. Meanwhile, Krum was discovering that possessing such an infamous trophy came with its own unique challenges. The Skull Cup had made him famous throughout the medieval world, but fame in the 9th century was a double-edged sword that could cut both ways depending on how skillfully it was wielded. Every diplomatic encounter now carried extra weight because everyone knew about his unconventional dinnerware. The cup's maintenance alone required constant attention from specialists who understood both the practical and symbolic dimensions of keeping imperial bone in perfect condition. The silver lining needed regular polishing to maintain its mirror-like finish, The bone itself required careful treatment with oils and preservatives that would prevent cracking or discoloration. A damaged skull cup would lose much of its psychological impact, so Krum invested considerable resources in ensuring his trophy remained as impressive as the day it was created. But the real genius of Krum's approach lay in how he used the cup to transform diplomatic meetings into psychological warfare sessions. When rival Khans or Byzantine representatives arrived for negotiations, they found themselves confronted not just with Bulgarian demands, but with the physical reality of what happened to those who opposed Krum's will. The skull cup sitting prominently on the negotiating table spoke louder than any threat or promise the Bulgarian leader might make. These encounters became legendary throughout medieval Europe for their calculated theatricality. Krum would often begin meetings by pouring wine into the skull cup and taking a ceremonial drink, all while maintaining eye contact with his guests. The message was unmistakable. This could be you if negotiations don't go well. The psychological pressure was so intense that many diplomats agreed to terms they might have rejected under normal circumstances. So there you have it, the story of how an emperor's skull became the most terrifying drinking cup in medieval history. One bad decision in a Bulgarian mountain pass transformed the ruler of the greatest empire on earth into dinnerware that would haunt diplomatic meetings for generations. Sometimes the difference between triumph and catastrophe comes down to a single moment of overconfidence. If this tale of medieval savagery fascinated you, check out my video about the Viking blood eagle ritual that makes skull cups look civilized.